Welcome to the debate. Today we're looking into the really quite bizarre death of James Turnbull. He was a cashier, quite prominent actually, at the Metropolis Trust Company, and his end came, well, not where you'd expect, but in a police court holding cell. He died very suddenly, and perhaps strangest of all, he was disguised as a burglar at the time. Now, initial reports suggested angina pectoris, a heart condition, but later, fueled by Helen McIntyre's insistence on an autopsy, the real cause emerged. Acanitine poisoning, a potent, active poison.
And that discovery, that specific poison, it just changes everything, doesn't it? It shifts the whole narrative from a personal tragedy or scandal into a full-blown criminal investigation. So the core question for us today, I think, is how do we interpret that poisoning? Was Turnbull's death, despite the aconitine showing up in the forensics, was it fundamentally an accident? Maybe a terrible mistake in self-medication driven by panic? Or did the circumstances, all the deception swirling around him, plus the poison, did that create an overwhelming suspicion of deliberate, premeditated homicide?
I'm going to argue that this was ultimately a tragic mistake. A fatal one, yes, but still a mistake, born out of stress, perhaps some negligence, and crucially, misplaced medicine. We know Turnbull had a serious heart condition, angina pectoris. He relied on medication, things like nitroglycerin or amyl nitrite, these fast-acting vasodilators, to manage attacks. His death happened right after his arrest, his exposure as this supposed burglar. Clearly a moment of extreme psychological distress. Now, the final collapse in the police cage, that was dramatic, absolutely. But the root cause, the poison, it seems to have been ingested hours before. You see, forensic chemistry gave us the key fact. Dr. Stone confirmed that aconitine, the neurotoxin they found, it typically takes about 4 hours, give or take, to become fatal. And the aconitine pills themselves, well, they turned out to belong to a Mrs. Brewster, prescribed for something called romantic neuralgia. Apparently, the butler, Grimes, had carelessly left them on the hall table at the McIntyre house. So picture Turnbull, around 1 a.m, during this bizarre burglary attempt. He feels an angina attack coming on. He's desperate for relief. It seems highly likely he fatally mistook Mrs. Brewster's aconine pills for his own nitroglycerin tablets, which often look quite similar. And the timing, ingestion around 1 a.m., death around 5 a.m., that fits the poison's latency period almost perfectly. So for me, it wasn't murder. It was a devastating accidental swap under incredible duress.
Well, I see a very different picture taking shape here. I acknowledge the timeline, the 4-hour latency for aconitine. That's scientific fact. But it doesn't just erase the powerful suspicion of foul play, does it? The immediate physical evidence, it really screamed crime. Think about Philip Rochester Turnbull's business partner, his roommate even. Rochester had, frankly, every motive imaginable to silence Turnbull. He was facing financial ruin, huge overdrafts, forged checks involving the Metropolis Trust, and there was also this romantic rivalry over Helen McIntyre. And what does Rochester do immediately after the death? He insists it was natural causes, tries to block the autopsy. That's suspicious behavior, to say the least. And then there's the other drug evidence. The handkerchief found near Turnbull in the cell cage, it was soaked with residue from 2 or more amyl nitrate capsules. Now, that's a significant amount, possibly even a lethal overdose itself, even if taken therapeutically. If Turnbull was already dying from aconite ingested hours earlier, why this frantic secondary overdose in the court? This combination, a slow poison and a massive overdose of his regular medication, it just doesn't feel like a simple mistake. It points, I think, towards deliberate confusion, a calculated effort perhaps by Rochester or maybe the master forger John Sylvester to either hasten Turnbull's death or muddy the waters about the actual cause. When you put it all together, the poison, the clear motive, the financial crimes, Rochester's deception and flight, it created an overwhelming, very credible case for premeditated murder. The investigators, they couldn't just ignore that.
I understand why that confluence of events, especially Rochester's behavior, which was undeniably incriminating, pointed towards malice. I absolutely get that. However, the forensic timing, that established the critical truth, didn't it? Even if Rochester, or perhaps Sylvester,
wanted Turnbull dead and maybe even tried to, let's say, facilitate his death later on, the aconite latency, that 4-hour window, it fundamentally refutes the initial police theory. The idea that someone slipped him something in the water glass in the police cage for a quick kill, the science just doesn't support that. The fatal dose was already doing its work. Now, about the amyl nitrite overdose. You see it as misdirection. I see it as pure, unadulterated panic during a massive heart attack. Imagine the situation. Arrested, publicly humiliated, exposed. He suffers a genuine angina attack. In desperation, he crushes maybe more capsules than usual of his actual medication, trying to get relief. But it doesn't work because his system is already fatally compromised by the acetine he took hours before. So the collapse wasn't caused by the amyl nitrite itself, but by the combination of the underlying poisoning and the massive cardiac stress. It actually confirms, in my view, that the crucial event, the accidental ingestion, happened back at the McIntyre house.
But doesn't that ask us to accept quite a bit about Turnbull's own carelessness, perhaps? The whole accident theory hinges on this idea that a man who depends on life-saving medication every single day, carries it with him, knows what it looks like, knows how it works, that this man would make such a basic fatal mistake even under stress. His nitroglycerin pills, they're typically small, often kept in a specific vial or box. The aconitin belonged to someone else, prescribed for a completely different ailment, likely in different packaging. How plausible is it, really, that even in a panic he confuses his fast-acting heart pills with a slow-acting neurotoxin?
Well, the plausibility isn't necessarily about identical packaging, but about the specific context in his physical state. Remember, some of Turnbull's own nitroglycerin tablets were found in the umbrella stand at the McIntyre house, right alongside the empty aconitin box cover. This strongly suggests he was already feeling the effects, maybe dizzy, disoriented, certainly not thinking clearly, and fumbling around possibly in the dark or in a rush during that whole burglary charade. And yes, nitroglycerin tablets are often small and white, perhaps kept in a small bottle or envelope. If Mrs. Brewster's aconitin pills were also small and white, maybe just left out on the hall table, a man in the throes of an attack, desperate, might just grab the nearest container of small white pills without scrutinizing the label. The fact that the empty aconitine box cover was found right there with evidence of his own medication, that points pretty strongly to the mistake happening exactly when and where he was looking for his heart tablets.
That reads like coincidence, though. I'd argue the evidence points more towards an intentional setup. We can't really discuss this without bringing John Sylvester fully into the picture. He's revealed later as the actual mastermind, the sophisticated forger behind the larger financial crimes. Sylvester was actively trying to retrieve that forged confession letter from Colonel McIntyre's desk around the time of Turnbull's death. He was cleaning up loose ends. Turnbull, as the bank cashier, was in a position to know about Rochester's forgeries, yes, but potentially also about Sylvester's much bigger scheme involving stolen securities. Now, if you have a criminal operator like Sylvester managing this whole web of deception, planting evidence, manipulating accounts, doesn't it strain belief that Turnbull's very convenient death was just a pure, unassisted accident?
Isn't it much more likely that Sylvester, needing Turnbull silenced, either directly gave him the aconitin or perhaps more subtly made sure those pills were right where a panicking, ill Turnbull would grab them by mistake? Knowing his heart condition, knowing his habits, it might not fit the classic definition of murder, like a stabbing, but it certainly feels like an elimination engineered by a very calculating criminal.
That distinction you make between an unassisted accident and an engineered environment is, I think, absolutely crucial. And I would agree Sylvester undeniably created the chaotic, high-stress conditions that directly led to Turnbull making that fatal error. But we have to stick to the forensic evidence we actually have. There's no proof Sylvester physically administered the poison. The strongest narrative supported by the evidence, like finding that empty box near Turnbull's own pills, is that Sylvester set the stage, created the pressure, but Turnbull himself performed the fatal act by taking the wrong pill. Legally, the difference between murder and, say, death resulting from criminal negligence or duress, it's significant.
So let's shift back to the initial police investigation. For weeks, Detective Ferguson was absolutely convinced it was homicide, and he was zeroing in on Rochester. Was that a justified focus at the time?
Oh, absolutely justified, completely. Even if the eventual truth about the timing of the poisoning undermined their specific theory of how it happened, you have to put yourself in Ferguson's shoes. You've got a dead body, confirmed poisoning by aconitine. You have a prime suspect, Rochester, with overwhelming motive, financial desperation, romantic jealousy. This same suspect immediately lies about the cause of death, tries to suppress the autopsy, and then flees under suspicious circumstances using a fake telegram. I mean, the sheer weight of that circumstantial evidence, motive, flight, deception, it practically screams homicide. It would have been completely negligent not to investigate it as murder, regardless of Rochester's initial claims of natural causes.
I agree. The police were entirely justified in their initial pursuit of the homicide angle based on Rochester's actions. They really had no choice. But then came the medical testimony, and that fundamentally shifted the necessary legal perspective. While all of Rochester's behavior created this powerful presumption of guilt, that one piece of scientific data, the 4-hour latency of aconitine, became this unshakable fact that forced a radical rethink. It physically disproved the idea of a quick poisoning by Rochester in the police cell. It forced them to look earlier and elsewhere, back to the McIntyre house. And that path eventually uncovered Sylvester's much deeper involvement and the true sequence of events.
And that right there is the essential tension in this whole case. The initial, perfectly rational suspicion built on motive and deceit pointed directly at a calculated murder. Yet the final conclusion, accidental ingestion, a mistake under pressure, it feels deeply counterintuitive precisely because the death served the criminal's interests so perfectly. The case forces us to accept this really complex chain of coincidences. The drug swap happening just so, the 4-hour timing working out exactly, all wrapped up in this elaborate cover-up. Meanwhile, the simpler explanation that a desperate criminal made sure a key witness was silenced, well, it still feels incredibly plausible, doesn't it?
It does feel complex. But while the entire situation was undeniably tangled up in crime, deceit, and immense pressure, I think we have to anchor ourselves to the established medical facts. Turnbull's known severe angina, the documented presence of Mrs. Brewster's aconitine pills right there at the scene of the burglary attempt, and that established 4-hour window for the poison's action. All of that, taken together, points strongly towards Turnbull's death being, at its core, a tragic accident of mismedication under almost unimaginable stress. He took the wrong drug at the worst possible time in a chaotic situation largely engineered by Sylvester.
It certainly shows how layers of criminal activity, the fraud, the forgery, the flight, can cascade into a death that looks for all the world like murder, even if the final physical act might have been self-administered poison. The ethical question, perhaps, or the legal one, remains. When the circumstantial evidence for murder is that compelling, should we ever feel entirely comfortable accepting the accident theory, even with scientific backing? It leaves a lingering doubt.
We are left then weighing the cold logic of forensic timing against the very powerful, but ultimately it seems misleading evidence that pointed towards deliberate intent. The source material really pushes us to appreciate just how complicated it can be to untangle these kinds of intertwined personal tragedies and criminal conspiracies.
Indeed. And it highlights how the difference between a criminally induced accident and the straightforward murder can hinge on something as precise and sometimes as elusive as timing. In this instance, 4 very critical hours.